What's up, my brother?
Wow, good afternoon.
Man, you look skinnier every week.
I feel skinnier every week.
Yeah, I was gonna say you got what, one more week?
One more week, officially. Yeah, it's one more week tomorrow, and then it's time to get big. Time to spend some time growing.
Yeah, how long are you gonna take off?
A year. I'll probably look to compete again, same time ish next year. I like the fall for competition season. It's means I can get lean through summer.
Yeah,
When it's a good time to be lean, and then spend winter and spring
yeah,
being a little thick.
that's such an interesting thing too. I have a new grad student that I'm working with right now, and he's really into kind of doing the whole bodybuilding thing.
Mm,
And so he came to work with me because of that, because we do some body composition stuff and whatnot. But it's so important to or talk about, I guess, with your graduate students as they're starting to kind of get ideas and bounce them off of you, especially if they want to do something ambitious like a training or a diet study.
mm,
Say, do not do this in the fall, because if we don't start until October, you're not starting until January, because
yep,
there's no one that's going to want to do one of these studies whenever it's November and they want to go see their family. You've got eight Thanksgivings. You got a Thanksgiving the week before for one
yep.
family. You got a Thanksgiving the actual week for the next family. Then you got finals coming up if you're in college. And so whatever it is that you're eating there, and then you go on break. And then nobody wants to do anything during break with Christmas and all that stuff too. So it's important to consider that for sure.
And even if you were to happen to get some kind of study off the ground during that time, it's just being able to standardize any of that, any dietary intake across the holidays and stuff like that gets exceedingly
Well,
difficult.
you get to that point, or when you're kind of in the holiday season, is not only do you have to consider the fact that they're going to do the diet probably wrong, and they're not going to follow whatever it is that you're doing, especially if it's a super restrictive diet and you're looking at something really fancy rather than just regular caloric restriction. You have to think about the burden that you're putting on the participants too, because you want to keep that retention rate up, because anything that you do with exercise interventions or nutrition interventions, I mean, you won't see giant sample sizes in there, and most people are relatively understanding of it because it's so difficult to keep people on those interventions for such a long period of time. Any extra burden that you're putting on them is going to increase that attrition rate, and then you're never going to get the study done, or you're going to just prolong the study to the point where you probably should have just started after the holidays anyways.
Yep.
And saved yourself some stress. But then you get in college situations where you also have to consider spring break as well, which is not as significant, but it's something to consider for sure. The best time is really kind of right after spring break, and then all the way up kind of through the summer, similar to kind of like what you were doing anyways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I don't know. It's kind of, you got to think about it being difficult at every time of year, because then over the summer, especially if you're using college campuses, your sample population just went away for the summer. So
Yeah.
it's like, well, do we start this, during the spring or summer when we might have a super limited amount of time before semester ends, to really utilize this population on campus, or do we do it during the fall or spring when there's like some breaks and holidays to account for, but our potential sample size might be larger.
Yeah. And, COVID definitely didn't help for whenever you were doing all your studies, but even before COVID, I will say that some of the best, maybe not best researchers in general, but the people who can pump out studies the best are the people who are going to be able to recruit from outside of the university and get them in, because you don't have to deal with all of those issues, but you're just basically extending your reach rather than just keeping it in this one kind of concentrated population who can be sometimes wishy-washy. Sometimes you get really great student participants, and sometimes you get student participants that go through student things, and the last thing they want to worry about is whatever intervention it is that you're doing.
Yep.
And then they can't go do X, Y, and Z, or they sleep in, or they do too much the night before, whatever it is.
I get it.
Yeah.
I've been there. I was that student, and then when I was an undergraduate participating in a study once at UTA, it was like during finals, like I was working, and the protocol that they were having me do, the number of visits, like I was super interested in what they're looking at, what they're doing, but I was part of their attrition rate. And, as a researcher now, I hate that was me, but like life happened. And like, the last thing I was worried about was trying to track all my food intake and, showing up for these 3 to 6 hour visits where I'm laying there immobile for however long it was.
Yeah, that's one big thing. And I'm actually kind of working on a grant right now. And thankfully our department is, really great in the fact that we connect both kinesiology and nutrition together. But speaking of kind of like tracking your dietary intakes, that's most people's biggest issue. Mm-hmm. And sometimes with research, we get really stuck on doing things this set way. Like I can't tell you how much I don't like doing 3-day dietary recall or dietary records.
Right.
I would so much rather do some form of digital, like our data collection kind of throughout the process. We have to do both. Either way, you do it. Typically the participants will do it really well for the first week or two. And then all of their data entry just starts to kind of wane and just completely go down. So anyways, back to how much I like our department, the fact that we can combine both those entities. It's so much better to be able to assign someone from nutrition, somebody like a registered dietitian who is equipped to do this, and the fact that they do this every day and that it's their job to really understand how to provide feedback and how to adjust dietary intakes to meet whatever particular requirements. And not only that, give recipes, give full meal plans or really quickly that are going to meet all the guidelines that we need them to do. And it takes a burden off the participant. And so that's works really well, in my opinion, to be able to do. So that's something important to consider. As not that anybody's going to consider it a bunch, but just having that kind of like voice in there to take away that burden is super important.
Right.
But I think
helps to have a bit more hands on deck.
Yeah. Well, I think you can have more hands on deck. I think sometimes it's about which hands sometimes too. Everybody's kind of got their niche that you want to put them in for those things on who's best equipped to do certain things. And I think that just having, like I said, the dietitians in there, it's just like, hey, I don't have to tell you anything. I need them to do this, go. And then you can do whatever it is you need to do. And then they're in the background doing everything that needs to get done to keep the study upright without having to dedicate a lot of time to training the individual to get them ready to go.
Right.
But anyways, I was going to say, let's go ahead and get started with our topic for today.
Yeah. Speaking of food.
Yeah.
When should we eat it and why?
Yes. So I guess today we'll talk about some nutrient timing. And I think, as I'm kind of like thinking about this last night and kind of, leading up into this conversation about, just how, with everything, exercise and nutrition, how contextual nutrient timing really is. And I think the first thing to do, and I think this will just branch off into a ton of different directions, is how about you explain what nutrient timing is? And then I'll kind of go back and forth with you there.
Right. So I hope we don't leave this, too open-ended by the time it's done, with too much of the it depends kind of answer, because that gets frustrating for people. Because from
I think we'll get somewhere.
It does depend on a lot of different things. Like our answer is going to change based on each individual person. But for the most part, nutrient timing is like your purposeful ingestion of specific types of food or quantities or types of macronutrients at a specific time during the day to more favorably impact any kind of responses you might have to exercise, sleep, or to improve muscle strength, body composition, substrate utilization, performance. Just specifically targeting a type of food, macronutrient breakdown, whatever it is around an event, whether that be exercise or sleep.
So I think the big thing there is, so there's two things, and you use the word, and I want to kind of separate one word from it, and that will kind of maybe help us stay more guided and hopefully eventually come to an endpoint on some recommendations or kind of, what it is that you should consider is probably the better way to say it. But the word purposeful is really, really important. And so there's first thing with purposeful is obviously just the word in itself is that there is a purpose for why you're doing this. You're purposely eating before some particular event or for some particular reason. It doesn't necessarily have to, when you just say purposeful, it doesn't necessarily have to mean any individual specific nutrient. And it doesn't have to mean any specific individual time. You're just purposely eating for X reason, right? And so typically you can ask somebody, do you purposely eat more because of X? Or do you purposely eat less? And so that would be purposely eating. So there's something that you're kind of using to guide, how you're eating. Whereas with nutrient timing, it is actually a form of purposeful eating where you're eating for a given purpose. However, that purpose is really, really specific, right? Where it is, I need to have better fuel, or I need to maximize my glycogen stores before I do this like really long endurance based event. I need to have more local more or maximize my glycogen locally for like resistance training events. And I need to do it at a very specific time rather than kind of just this general thing. And again, has to be a specific nutrient. So there's nutrient timing, whereas that specific nutrient for that specific goal purposefully. And so not just in general, but everything is very, very specific with that. And so, there's a bunch of different things I think that go along with that, which, with just basic nutrient timing, I to just keep it really specific because you can go down a million different rabbit holes with it, is I think for the sake of applicability and understanding, it's best to probably not do things or discuss things maybe like vitamins, right? Because you could do things like calcium, iron, nutrient timing, right? Depending on our particular diseases or before exercise, you can do caffeine, you can do a bunch of different things. That gets, again, way out there and even more contextual.
Right. Yeah. You're
And we're going
down a specific rabbit hole on those.
Right. And I think people like, eventually we'll have Andy Andreas Kreutzer on. And he's the person you want to talk to about nutrient timing for things like caffeine and how much. I don't think either of us would be good to talk about caffeine anyways, because I think there's always a steady flow of caffeine.
Oh, yeah.
From
I've already had to say, hey, once prep's over, I need like outside help. Really limiting my caffeine intake.
Yeah, I know, man. I'll tell you what, getting ready for the semester, I don't think that there's a minute in from the time I wake up to when I go to bed where there's not some caffeine in kind of circulating through. Mm-hmm. But anyways, yeah, so you don't want to go through those. So I think it's really important to stick with the couple things. So just, you can talk about food in general and whatnot, but I think sticking with the carbohydrates and the protein are the best things to do. Specifically, I think because there's more, how do I say it? Let's stick with the carbohydrates first, because I think that's kind of easier to apply and it's easier to kind of separate from when or who should do it or when you should do it and how to apply that situation. So with carbohydrates, I'm curious to get your take, with resistance training. What do you think with carbohydrates and nutrient timing for resistance training?
Right. So personally, I always, just based on my own, personal experience, and then also taking a look at what the literature says, I always target a carbohydrate source before training. Usually it depends. Sometimes it's a more fast digesting carb, more simple carbohydrate source, like 15-20 minutes before. Other times I'll have something a little slower digesting, a little more complex, oatmeal, something like that, an hour or hour and a half, 90 minutes before, making sure I have, as optimal as like right now, it's suboptimal all the time because I'm in a caloric deficit all the time. But sure. even in off season, I'd want to have optimal energy and glycogen stores to fuel my workout. So because that's the first energy source we're going to turn to is our stored glycogen in the muscles. So I want to be sure that is fully supplied or the best I can. If you're dieting, you just optimize it the most you can. But so just targeting, I always target a carbohydrate source before workout. And then, you can talk about the post-workout carbohydrate. Like, do we need to have a carbohydrate source with our post-workout protein to, enhance, protein shuttling there and NPS. There's different data going back and forth there, but we'll stick to the pre-carbohydrate discussion right now. But I always think it's a good idea to kind of preload a little bit with some carbohydrates before training session.
Yes, for sure. So I think so within that too, so there's even a few things to kind of digest there. So the biggest thing you said is that you pretty much always kind of try and consume some form of carbohydrate before you work out. So number one is you actually, and it's quite interesting how many individuals will actually do this. And I think you've talked about it on one of the videos before, is how many people will train fasted.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And, when you're talking about things like, is it going to be or improve weight loss, or is it going to improve fat oxidation, right? So, obviously that there's going to be the, law of thermodynamics that kind of determines all of that. But if we're just talking about performance specifically, like how well you're performing on a within day, or just like within that particular workout, not across days, right, on how you end up over, training season or whatever, I would never recommend that you would train fasted, right? Because performance is going to suffer. And what's really, go ahead here.
No, I say if performance is your goal, an optimal performance in a training session, you're right. Training fasted, you just really no room for it.
Yeah, the performance is just going to suffer so much, and you also want to consider not just you're training fasted, let's say, and then eventually you're going to end up let's say you're trying to lose weight, you're going to end up the same as if you had trained fed, as long as calories and protein, everything are controlled. Now, over the period or a longer duration, you could potentially run into even more issues with training fasted if you continue to have those performance detriments over time, right? Obviously, the performance is going to continue to decline if you're having terrible performance, right, over time. And so that's obviously not a good idea. But even outside of that, what I think is interesting is you said you pretty much always do it. And that's actually relatively represented in the literature, that unintentionally, before particularly aerobic exercise, but I would imagine, and that's a little speculative, but I would imagine that people also do it before resistance training. But people are really eating before they go work out unintentionally whenever they have planned exercise, whether it's in the morning, whether it's in the afternoon, whatever. People are typically eating before they go work out, unless they're intentionally or purposefully training fasted, right? So I think the issue is with that. And another reason why it's so important to eat before is what you actually see, especially in your endurance athletes, so people who are doing aerobic exercise, running, cycling, whatever, is that even whenever they are intentionally eat, right, before they go and do some form of exercise, the amount that they eat is still not enough to get them out of a caloric deficit from their training. And so if you're having this kind of like really long duration training, and of course you're not overeating, these are generally athletes that I'm kind of talking about, is that even whenever you're purposely eating at that time, you're not really making it back up or throughout the day to the point that you would need to kind of maintain your weight. And then especially if you're somebody, now this happens in males too, but if you're a female athlete, it's even more important to eat before, because even if you eat before, you're still not getting your calories in for the day to help you maintain the weight. So imagine if you didn't eat before, right? How much less you're going to have after that. And then you're just going to basically accelerate some of the potential, issues that go along with like female athlete triad, also now called REDS, because it happens to males now too. And like I said, males can go through it as well, where you have the decreased testosterone, right? Or impacted reproductive function, all that bad stuff if you continuously eat in that deficit. Now, again, super contextual. Some people are just fine. Typically depends on other dietary habits, eating and things like that. But all to go on to say is that you really should have something to eat before, specifically those carbohydrates to improve. Now, that I'm a hyperverbal, so if you have anything or you want to add to that, I'll let you go ahead and put that in there before I keep going.
No, you usually kind of hit the nail on the head there. I think here it goes with, it depends thing again, but
Sure.
you know, it's going to, this is going to depend too on your specific training goals. So even within the athletic population, what is my target goal? How, what is my specific strength training style? What am I doing that day? What am I trying to fuel to optimize my training session, then optimize my gains overall, gains in performance, gains in muscle hypertrophy. So like for me, I'm always thinking about how am I going to best fuel this training session to optimize my chance for muscle hypertrophy, or right now while I'm dieting to optimize the odds for muscle loss, so reducing any potential muscle loss. So it isn't
It
like we have
depends.
a strict recommendation going here. It does depend. You have to think about your specific athletic goal, your specific goal for your athlete, your client, whatever it is as you're programming food around. But yeah, it depends. So
Yeah. So I think even now, I think it's probably a good, you can even make it it'll be a good time to kind of get into some kind of a recommendation as to what you should do. And I think keeping it in line with resistance training. And I think I'll try and put it in as big, or put it into the context of resistance training as best as I can. The only thing is, with a lot of the current recommendations that you're going to get, most of it's going to be specifically for carbohydrates because of how important it is for aerobic exercise. Most of the recommendations you're going to get are for aerobic exercise. And a lot of that is going to be because, it's really hard to delineate how much you need or how much you need to maximize glycogen stores for resistance training. And I'll kind of describe why that is. Really it's because, when we talk about resistance training and glycogen, maximizing your glycogen to be able to fuel your exercise and perform at a high level, we're talking about full body exercising for the most part, as far as depleting glycogen from, resistance training. And when we talk about resistance training, of course, that goes, again, just you lifting weights or exercising against resistance. We're talking about high volume resistance training. So something that you would do with in things like bodybuilding, right? Bodybuilders are pretty notorious for just doing the high volume exercise, which is going to be way different than some people who are going to be, power lifters who are doing the 1, 2, 3 rep or lifts. They're never really tapping into those glycogen stores. And then they're resting long enough that they're really, again, able to kind of replenish everything else, use that. And they're never really, like I said, kind of tapping into that glycogen. So it really only should be directed at the individuals that are doing that high volume resistance training, similar to like what you get at bodybuilders, 3 to 6 sets, 8 to 12 reps, right? But the thing is that you want to keep in a context that kind of maximizing that glycogen is really specific to kind of doing the multi-body part training sessions. Because let's say you're going to go in there and you're going to do just biceps, right? But let's not act like that's uncommon, right? So anyways, let's say you go in there and do biceps. Well, you go in there, you tap out your biceps, and that's great. And sometimes people are like, oh, I need to maximize my glycogen. I need to eat all this glycogen because I need to restore my fuel. We didn't really use that much glycogen overall, right? Because you only did it from one individual muscle. And the thing about the human body relative to what you would get out of the animal body is that everything that you do with glycogen oxidation or glycogen usage is you can only pull it locally, right? So it's only going to come out of that bicep whenever you're working out from the bicep. You can't just donate glycogen from the leg and go give it to the bicep for it to be able to use. But sometimes I think that's kind of the idea, is that if you have a really crazy, let's say, arm workout, then you feel like you kind of tax the entire system. And so you're going to go overeat at that point. And then you're going to run into the issues of overeating. Now you're going to perform at a high level because you're overeating. And so that feels great. But maybe your body composition goals are never really met. And you're wondering why. Well, it's maybe because you're overestimating how much fuel you're actually using right within the session relative to the actual muscle or the volume that you're working out with too. So there's kind of all that goes into, hey, let's think about the context of the situation before you actually start like chowing down a bunch of carbohydrates.
Dang,
Right.
my lifts and my training sessions have never been better, but God, I'm fat all the time. I can't lose any
Yeah.
weight.
That's what you'll see. I mean, that's where you get the people who, are in there and working out, and, they're on a diet and everything. And it's just that they're eating too much. Like, hey, you're eating, what I hate to use the word, but you're eating clean food, right? You're eating, your chickens, your broccolis, you're eating your low fat, basically, foods. And you're like, okay, yeah, that sounds great. And then you look at like the volume or the size of the meal and you're like, oh my gosh, you're eating 3 cups of rice per meal. Don't do that. Right. And you're having 6 meals. Oh my gosh. Right. And so and that's kind of how sometimes you'll see with bodybuilders or weightlifters specifically, that they'll tend to overestimate how many carbohydrates they need, right, in order to perform at the level they need to be able to perform at, to have, increased muscle protein synthesis and growth and all that good stuff. So there's really no real number to put on it right there. And I would probably advise against kind of the endurance training recommendations. I think for resistance training, between 5 and 12 grams per kilogram is fine, but you definitely want to monitor it more so whenever you're not kind of that like long duration aerobic exerciser that's working out at a high VO2 max %.
Right.
And so I think you probably would agree with most of that for the most part.
Yeah.
And so, and I know everything's kind of super, again, it gets so crazy to have, try and put it in the context with your resistance athletes or your sporting athletes with carbohydrates relative to what you would do with cyclist, runners, things like that, because they have every guideline ever. Like, hey man, you need 8 to 12 grams per kilo per day. Maybe if you're doing a light training session, then you can go between 5 and 7. And that should suffice. Put that in a solution, with some electrolytes, and you're going to be just fine. But I do want to put into a context as well with endurance athletes. These are endurance athletes, right? These are not kind of the casual every other day doing a 30-minute cardio session, at the regular gym. These are people who need the carbohydrates to be maximized, that are cycling at 70% of their VO2 max. And not only that, they need to push that power to go uphill if they're a cyclist, let's say, or to swim if they're a triathlete, like all these things. They actually need that. For your just general regular gym goer, let's say, because I'm not hating on anybody for doing that, but I think, again, it's just, if you're not consistently doing, higher intensity endurance exercise, you should really monitor that and not necessarily go with some of those higher end recommendations.
Right. You're not the endurance runner or cyclist if you're just, Joe Schmo going and getting his lift in. You're not this endurance runner or cyclist that's trying to fuel a 17-mile run or whatever it is, where they need that 70 grams of carbs right before they do it to fuel it. You're going and hitting up maybe an hour of resistance training, but these days half of it's spent cruising around on Instagram or phones, like 30 minutes of resistance training. Goal-based, don't pull what most people do and just go way overboard.
Yeah. Don't forget about the time it takes me to set up my phone with like some little like weights, or weight setup to be able to video myself working out.
Oh yeah, you're right.
That's like a whole 5 to 7 minute.
I always have a whole like gallon I bring in with me, so it's just a big. It's nice to set my phone against. It's
so smart. So smart. I'm like I'm like crushing my phone in between 2 weights to like hold it up. I know it's
you gotta be more time efficient with your videoing.
I know I gotta get better. That's what it is. That's why I've been getting fatter with my carbohydrate consumption. It's because of my phone thing. But even with that, so I kind of just did a calculation to put things into perspective for, for most people. So even when we talk about the endurance athletes, so there's always that thing, there's people that overestimate, right? But then there's also kind of the people that will underestimate. And so I think it's kind of good to put into perspective what the recommendations actually entail from let's say a gram perspective. So if you have, 5 to 12 grams before exercise, right? Kind of being the typical recommendation. And again, we're kind of going into what you should eat. This is all pre 1 to 4 hours before, right? It's kind of that sweet spot. So definitely a little bit closer to that 1 hour mark, I would probably recommend. But it seems to be okay to maximize glycogen within that time frame. But if you think about that 5 to 12 grams per kg, well, if you think about how many kgs you are, I'm 190 pounds. That puts me at 86 kilos. 86 times 12, right? That's 800 and something, 900 grams plus of carbohydrates, right? Whatever that 8 times 12 is. I'm not going to do the math right now, but that's 900 grams of carbohydrates. And so if you're just to multiply that by the calories per gram, so the 4 calories per gram, that's an insane amount of calories that you would get from carbohydrates. So that's what, 36, make sure my math is right, 3,600 if I were to just do, 800 or 900 grams. Is my math right? Yeah, I think so. There we go. Yeah, so 36 or 3,600. There's no way I can eat, or I should eat 3,600 grams of carbohydrates, right? Because I don't work out to the extent that I would need to have that many carbohydrates. And I didn't really tap out my glycogen stores yesterday during my workout anyways. And so again, it's number one, relative to where your kind of glycogen stores are at, which is not easy to identify by any means. There's a lot of technology that goes into that. You were there, we were doing the muscle sound stuff. Mm-hmm. And even that's not given, it's not a bad technology. It's relative to the individual.
Right.
It can give you some way of tracking it, but, it's difficult for the average person to be able to determine where you're at. And then you continue or you use those guidelines kind of unknowingly. And now you're eating that many carbohydrates and there's no reason for you to be doing that. Because even if you went down to the 5 grams per kilogram, that's still quite a calorie amount of carbohydrates that I'm needing to consume to fuel the exercise, right? So it's really important to, if you are going to follow those recommendations, to number one, if you're going to implement it, which I recommend, depending on, I'm assuming that you're working out the way that you should be for that type of intake, but to monitor it really over time to make sure that it's not more than what you actually need, because there's no reason, again, that a lot of people need that many calories from carbohydrates for the most part. So there's that. And not only that, it's really hard to get that many grams of carbohydrates in per day. I am what I would consider a professional, and I don't know how I would do it in my own world, other than if we think about what we did with the keto study and we needed people to meet their, carbohydrate amount, what did we tell them to do? We told them to
drink, just like slam sodas. Yeah.
Slam sodas. Hey, do you have a Gatorade on hand? I don't care, not necessarily I don't care, but, hey, I know it's midnight. I need you to go ahead and drink this because we have to stay compliant or with the intervention. So can you drink a soda? And so you get a bunch of these really not great practices just trying to meet this calorie amount, right? And that's not good either. And then, of course, you don't want to have, too little, but you don't want to go on the extreme end in either way, where you're just slamming these things to be able to get the carbohydrate amount. Take that smarter approach and say, okay, this is what I need. It's, I've been doing this for a little bit. I don't feel like I'm maximizing our glycogen. I can add a little bit more. Let's go up to 5.5 or, 6, whatever. You don't have to go in exact 1, gram intervals. You can do half or whatever. But continue to monitor, go up or down relative to what you need or how you look for your perspective. I mean, I'm sure you've seen some fluffy people.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. So that's one of my main considerations is, how am I looking today? What does my carbohydrate intake need to look like today based on how I look, and then I'll divvy those out, a little bit in the morning, and then make sure I'm having some pre-workout to just really fuel the training session, make sure I'm getting a good pump in, Because like how I look when I'm pumped up is like really important in my training session, because then it's going to give me a good idea of how I'm going to look pumped up like on stage.
Mhm.
So just making sure I have an optimal amount of carbohydrates in to fuel that training session based on my appearance alone is really important. And when you're at this point in like leanness or like really getting ready for deep into prep or whatever, your look changes a lot more drastically than the average person. So like I will look very differently in the morning than I will in the evening, or right after a training session versus right before, just because your body is so in tuned to anything that you're giving it, because it's been so depleted for so long of everything. So it's like fantastic carbohydrates. Let's store all of these. Let's shuttle this all away right now. And bam, after my workout, I'm nice and full. I look great, not just from the muscle, the muscle being pumped just from the blood and everything like that, but from it shutting a lot of the glycogen in there from the food I ate before the workout. So that's kind of what you have to go for is in my field in bodybuilding, especially like before stage. Like I want to really shuttle all these carbohydrates in right before, which brings it back to.
Oh yeah, I was going to say there's definitely only 2 times that I'm taking a selfie, and that's one in the morning, and
Oh,
that's whenever you're taking the shirtless picture, and then while I'm at the gym, whenever I'm pumped up. There's only 2 times. Otherwise, you're not catching me. You're not catching me any other way on camera,
nope.
showing off any muscle at all.
In the morning when you're
So,
fasted and you got some like, man, my abs like paper thin. What the heck? And then at the end of the day, I'm a fat POS. What has happened?
I feel like I'm White Goodman at the end of dodgeball by the
Oh
time I
yeah,
eat meal number 2, and I just feel so terrible about
yeah.
myself. But anyways, but you know what? That feeling terrible helps me get to the gym every day. I'm like, oh no, I'm not letting this happen,
Negative
even though I know
reinforcement
it's
is
not
a
real.
powerful tool.
Yeah. But yeah, and I think with the carbohydrate thing, and I think we'll have some talks coming up, especially with, fat not being bad and some other things. But carbohydrates are so demonized right now, and they really shouldn't be. There's really a lot of data to suggest. I can't remember which paper that I was just reading the other day. About overall mortality. I mean, it's pretty much consistent over time that not eating enough fruits and vegetables, whole grains, right, is highly associated with or with mortality. And so, of course, you want to be able to get those carbohydrates in. Now that's where you get to the maybe individuals will demonize carbohydrate consumption because the carbohydrates that they've consumed up to the point where they have tried to make some sort of dietary shift or adjustment to lose weight are probably not great sources of carbohydrates. But it's also not just the carbohydrates that you were eating or drinking, because gosh, you don't realize how many carbohydrates are in a soda. But you have the added sugars, of course. And anyways, I'm kind of going off on a tangent there. Let me get back in line. But you don't need to demonize them. You just had a bad experience all the way up to the point that you decide to lose some weight. Carbohydrates seem to be the way to get yourself out of maybe a hole that you've dug, but maybe it's not the right hole, or maybe it's not the right shovel to use to get out of the hole that you kind of put yourself in. Because in general, let's say you were having individuals, let's eliminate things like sugary drinks and alcohol for just a second, in specifics with, let's say, athletes, because athletes are going to consume Gatorades and things like that, just because, they're endurance athletes, they need to have some of that during exercise carbohydrate. But most people really are, from an athletics perspective, eating an absurd amount of carbohydrates per day. I mean, we're, doing a bunch of the investigation into the habits of some of the endurance athletes. Now it's different for resistance training individuals, but they're really not eating the amount of carbohydrates that they would need to be eating. So we actually look at the data that we're kind of collecting at the moment, and now it's a kind of a smaller sample size at the moment. So I would have caution in just kind of the point that I'm about to make, is that we're typically seeing that endurance athletes, people that are actually practicing some of these things, and even some of your professional or elite endurance athletes, I mean, they're getting between 2 and 4 grams. I mean, we're not even hitting the threshold for what they should be consuming per day. And it's often more likely 2 grams per kg. We're getting in between, 200 to 300 or 300 grams per day, which doesn't equate to that many calories overall. So typically the general person who's just eating normally is consuming a greater caloric amount from fat, which is not great either. But the great thing is that what most exercisers, or at least amateur exercisers, are conscious of is protein. Some weird way. So elite athletes, people like your high-level bodybuilders or your elite endurance athletes, they are concerned about performance. That's what they want. They want to perform at a high level. Every workout's got to be good, because you as a bodybuilder can speak to how terrible it is when you have a bad workout. Right? Nothing feels worse. You got to think about that the rest of the day, how far you put yourself behind. Even if it's just one day, it's hard to get that out of your mind.
Oh, yeah.
And then your elite athletes, a lot rides on that, right? On how well they perform. And so they're like, I'd rather have all the fuel than not enough fuel. Right. Whereas some of your more amateur people, specifically like your amateur bodybuilders or your endurance athletes, or endurance individuals, I'll say, because we keep putting it in the realm of athletes, but not every athlete, is protein. Everybody's are worried about recovery and body composition, right? I want to gain muscle. I want to make sure that I'm getting my gains. And then I want to make sure that I am just, enhancing recovery from this, right? And so maybe that might be, I can't decide if it's a good idea from there to switch into protein, or if we should go in during or intra carb. Speak on intra carbohydrates, and let's go to protein after that.
Well,
or whatever else.
So with intra workout consumption of carbohydrates, one, you need to be very selective and careful of what that source is, because you don't want anything that's going to be too slow digesting during your workout, because you're already reallocating all of your resources away to the muscles, right? So like your digestive work is going to be diminished and slowed already. So you don't want to be putting something in your stomach that's going to take a long time to digest and be super problematic. So that brings us to like, what should I have intra-workout? How much of it? For the most part, I don't do a lot of intra-workout stuff because I don't necessarily need it to fuel my style of training. I do a lot of high volume work, as most bodybuilders do, but I don't necessarily need the, intra-workout fuel to keep going, unless it's just like, I don't know, maybe we deep into prep when I'm like the super low energy. Sometimes I'll do like just throw a rice cake down or something. But for the most part, like, I know my body. I know what my type of training is. I don't necessarily need it. So like, if you have if you're, maybe an athlete doing some sort more endurance or more, even more high volume, maybe that sugary beverage, sports drink, or, any kind, they make all kinds of like gummies and stuff now, like high energy or high carb gummies that are like super quick digesting, kind of, I don't know, they might help fuel a little bit of performance, but those might be even more like mental acuity than anything else, because we know what kind of effect that even just tasting something sweet has on our mental drive and our ability to focus. So that might be a benefit in the training of yourself to stay motivated and focused. Just putting something sugary in your mouth,
Yeah. So I'll say here's kind of something for everyone to think about is, especially with kind of the subjective component of just having something sweet, right? If you're feeling like you're overly exhausted, tell me what is the better feeling. Is it better to drink a Gatorade when you wake up in the morning, or is it better to drink a Gatorade whenever you have just done the hardest workout that you've ever done? Let's say it's outside, you're running sprints, flipping tires, and you are just drenched in sweat. How much better does that Gatorade taste?
I'll take option B.
Compared to the night. Yeah. So there's some actually really adaptive things going on. There's some really big psychological things there, right? To help you kind of continue and find reward and some of those are things depending on, right, the situation that you're in. The Gatorade does not taste as good in the morning as it does after the hardest workout of your life. And there's a reason for that, is because you need, some of the things that are inside that
Oh,
Gatorade.
I didn't earn it in the morning. It didn't,
Exactly. Yeah. The receptors there are not as sensitive, right, in the mouth. Right. So, something to really think about, like you said there too, if you need, a lot of it is really subjective, but for the type of training that you're doing, again, we go back to, everything's really local, right? We're doing a high volume exercise, but it's really not taxing the kind of or the full glycogen system where you would need to kind of do this crazy overload. Plus, then we get into kind of the time component of it as well, right? So when we say like endurance athletes that need to have something or during their exercise, that's because they're typically going for longer than an hour, right? They're going for like they're going, 90 minutes or so. And that's whenever you need to start kind of having that kind of 30 to 60, 60 gram can be high, but let's just say 30 to 60 gram are kind of the recommendation to have every hour during that really long duration exercise. I can't, don't quote me on it exactly, but I can't remember if it's 60 or 90 minutes for that. But after a certain duration, then including in some of the intra-workout carbohydrates is going to be beneficial from that perspective. That goes back into, okay, they're, endurance athletes, they're consistently exercising, right, at a relatively high percent of their VO2 max. So, 70% of their VO2 max. Whereas with your resistance training, you're doing high volume and you're gaining, you're going to gain muscle, and it's a different type of training, but you're not going for 90 minutes straight, right, where you're moving the entire time. There is a required rest period in between there for you to be able to have, do such exercise. And so, right, there's going to be limited usage relative to somebody who's going on 90 minutes, right, 90 full minutes of full on exercise. Now, I think that I'm not trying to say that resistance training is not like beneficial or not hard by any means, right? They're two different or totally different things, and they're for two totally different goals, right? But it's less important to have some of those intra-workout carbohydrates during the resistance training. Again, very contextual, right? It depends. There are times whenever you would need that, but relative to like a higher, or like aerobic based exercises, not so much. And, you also want to consider too, if you're on a particular dietary program, how does that fit into your diet program as well? If you're kind of overdoing carbohydrates during exercise. But I think you can probably speak. I think you probably read things more recently than I have, to be able to speak on it more quickly. Is what does the muscle protein synthesis look like with carbohydrate ingestion during resistance training? Off the top of your head?
So again, this kind of, God, what was the study that, I'll think of it in a minute, but it really, it's kind of in a varied literature on looking at that, seeing how the muscle protein synthetic rates vary when you consume carbohydrates during and after. For the most part, if I'm remembering correctly, there was some of the studies that found that there were improvements in MPS post-workout with carbohydrate supplementation during, even though there were improvements, they weren't necessarily significant. It was like trending towards significance kind of thing. I can't remember what their subject population was, but irregardless,
Sure.
It seems to be kind of fairly negligent whenever you're looking at MPS, which that's a whole another rabbit hole we can, dive down another time, looking at stimulating MPS rates post-workout. But yeah, fairly negligible overall.
Yeah, so I think kind of with maybe it's probably time for us to move to protein and then some other things with nutrient timing. But I think you can agree or disagree. I think a good place to say with carbohydrates would be, okay, obviously you should be consuming carbohydrates prior to exercise, and don't recommend doing something fasted. You can also do a mixed meal, right, before something as well. I think we don't spend enough time on mixed meals. I think maybe people are more interested in individual macronutrients, but a mixed meal is fine too. Protein, carbohydrates, fat, right? Nothing too heavy. Limit the fat that's in there, but fat's not going to kill you if you have it as a part of the meal. But nothing really high in saturated fats. Like, I think you talked about it. I can't remember if it's on a video or if just with us, is the importance of, how are fat affecting digestion as well. And so if you are going to consume a mixed meal, maybe consume the mixed meal a little bit further away from exercise relative to if you were going to consume something like carbohydrates by themselves, right? From a digestion perspective. So that's something to consider. Be conscious of of your actual exercise. Are you going at that really high intensity? Are you getting up to that VO2 max percent, or let's say, are you getting up to a high percent of your maximum capabilities from an endurance perspective? And is your high volume training as a resistance exercise or a resistance training exerciser, do you still need, again, that much? And what did your glycogen or replenishment look like before, right? What kind of muscle are you training? How long are you training, right? What do your rest things look like? Really monitor it. And I think you said it, there's nothing, I'm a huge proponent of the mirror test, right? Hey, how do you look, right? How do you look every day, and adjust from there? And again, just adjust based on what the actual training is. So again, it comes back to, it depends, right? How much you should take in really depends on the training. Now, if you're a high level endurance exerciser that's going to be training for over an hour at a decent level, consume a fair amount of carbohydrates. And if you need to do it really quickly, or if you need to replenish carbohydrates really quickly, maybe a quick source of carbohydrates, right? Something more sugary would be fine, but generally nothing too crazy. Then for intra, same kind of thing. Endurance exercise for a long duration, drink some carbohydrates during, eat some carbohydrates during. But if you're not, and you're kind of just a resistance trainer, a general resistance trainer, again, context here, general resistance trainer, then, or a general endurance exerciser, do what's going to help you have the best performance, even if it's subjective, right? Because that's going to probably dictate most or almost everything. Is, okay, you ingested an extra 25, 30 grams of carbohydrates. That's not going to influence your body composition to some significant degree if it helps you perform way better than you would have without it, even if it is subjective. But again, be mindful.